welcome everybody. It's nice to see everyone here tonight. I'm Jennifer Guillio. I'm the host for the evening. Our topic tonight is deep listening. And when I was thinking about my own experiences with deep listening, I would define deep listening is when our heartstrings reverberate. How I feel when I've experienced deep listening. And I just wanted to share before we start with Jamie, I just wanted to share a little bit about my experience with deep listening. I work for a nonprofit in Minneapolis, and I had a program a couple years ago where I would bring people together, mostly older adults, oftentimes that lived in high rises, and I would bring them together for story circles. And in our story circles, we would meet in groups of anywhere from 2 to 16 people. For about an hour. If it was a larger group, about an hour and a half. We would meet for 4 weeks. Each week we would have a story prompt. And in the story circles, they're very specific guidelines. And this is what helped me learn what deep listening really feels like and what that feels like when your heart starts to reverberate with somebody's story. So at the story circles, the ground rules are you only can talk when you have the talking stick, and you wait till the very end when everyone's had a chance to go before you, ask any follow-up questions. And so as you start out with your story prompt, and everyone just kind of does it on the fly. No one knows what the questions are before they sit down. But they're often pretty easy. Like the first one we always start with is, how did you come to live in the Twin Cities? And so imagine complete strangers going around a circle and telling kind of their origin stories. And I found that it was so powerful to sit in a circle and knowing that I can't talk, I can't have a conversation, I just have to sit there and listen as people are creating their stories in their heads and getting them out. And it really becomes holy. It is such a special event to take part of, and I just feel really blessed at all the stories I've gotten to hear from people leading these story circles. And I was excited when a couple, although I don't know how long ago because it's COVID time and I can't keep track of when things have happened, but I think it might have been 2 months ago. Sorry, my eyes are burning from the onions I had with dinner. I'm not actually crying. We had some stories shared during one of our Sundays together, and it was so touching, and it reminded me of these story circles I'd been doing with work and how my heart just came alive being able to hear people's stories. And so I'm really glad that we've been able to fold in stories into our coffee houses. So I'm really happy to be a part of this tonight. So that's a little bit about my experience with deep listening, and I will turn it over to Jamie for our first.
Okay, well, now that I saw how many people are actually on here, not just a half a dozen I can see, now I'm even more nervous.
Don't forget to mute everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I was saying I'm more nervous about doing this than I am about performing as a singer. So anybody who knows me, at least a little, probably knows that I'm a strong extrovert. which means that I am quite verbal. Extroverts process their thoughts and feelings and problem solve aloud. That is less true the older I become, because by now I know how to solve a lot of problems. But that is a topic for another time. There's nothing that I like more than telling a funny story to a group of friends and making them laugh. But I also listen. I listen deeply at times. Deep listening occurs in three major areas of my life and some.
Oops. Wait, one moment. Sorry, Jamie. I'm sorry about that. And
Okay.
I just lost you. There we go. Sorry about
All
that.
right. So did you hear about I listen deeply at times? Okay. All right. Deep listening occurs in three major areas of my life and some minor areas too. In my work as a social worker, particularly in my work as a bilingual, culturally competent social worker, deep listening is a prerequisite and a highly developed skill. In my vocational life, my principal hobby requires deep listening. In my work as a social worker for the past 40 years, I've been privileged to listen to countless stories, sometimes from people in great pain. That is how people naturally communicate, in stories. More educated people sometimes use concepts like codependency or trauma that must be broken down to understand what they mean in their own particular situation in order to help them. This requires deep listening so that I can later adapt my skills and knowledge to help them in a way that is most meaningful for their own lives and families. The first and most basic skill a social worker has is empathy or unconditional regard. This requires very deep listening. This means you must strive to see the other person's predicament from their point of view, not your own. With someone you already have a trusting relationship with, such as a friend or a relative, it is no different. Most trusted confidants jump right to problem solving or advice giving, leading to frustration on both parts with no movement towards progress. In this age of political division, think about a friend who has a different political view than your own. How would you go about trying to listen to, or trying to get them to vote for the candidate that you favor? It starts with deep empathic listening, such as they teach at Braver Angels. It used to be called Better Angels. It isn't as easy as it sounds. As a social worker, we have to sometimes circle back and use empathy again when things are tense or stuck in a family or with an individual. This means more deep listening. I worked with a family where the father was an angry alcoholic who was often yelling. He was frustrated by the behavior of his teenage daughter and was once again yelling in a family session. I turned to him and said, "How much do you love and fear for your daughter?" He burst into tears. Deep listening told me that his anger hid more tender feelings. I was then able to work with his softer side now that he had showed it to his family and help them make some progress in mending family relationships. To continue, it is affirmation of their own experience and perspective that leads to the gift of trust. With that trust, you can do many things with a family or an individual. Help them find new perspectives, help them find new solutions, and even tell them things that they don't want to hear, although in a palatable way, that could lead to change. These are the other, sometimes more sophisticated skills that help a person progress, but it all begins with the deep listening required for empathy. As a bilingual, culturally competent social worker, I use the above skills, but I also sometimes interpret for clients seeking services from another professional. The ethics of an interpreter require that you not add anything extra. That is fine for people who are truly peers with the same social status, with no power differential, similar educational status, and a reasonable understanding of how our culture and society work. As a social worker, I would be violating my professional ethics to ignore those differences. So I listen deeply to look for what is missing in the communication. The other professional usually starts out by stating the reason why we are here. However, a lot of assumptions about why we are here are not stated. For example, if the reason we are here is because of a complaint of abuse or neglect by a parent, the investigator does not usually understand that the client knows little about the child protection system, the reason for its existence, the laws, the rights of the parent, and the implications for their lives. So I must add much of this for the client. I must provide them this background and the understanding of the implications and possible outcomes. I must also understand the cultural perspective of the client, who may have unnecessary fears or misinformation or be unwittingly behaving in ways that could result in an unfavorable outcome. They come from a country where the government is not only untrustworthy, but to be feared. Are they therefore fearing that they might be jailed or that they might be reported to immigration or be deported? Putting literacy skills aside, I also need to understand that their home country, that in their home country, they do not live in an age of information with easy access to information and the belief that they have a right to that information. Therefore, the local grapevine is their main source of information. Has the local grapevine told them that they will automatically lose their children if child protection becomes involved? Or that their child will become schizophrenic if they take ADD, medication for ADHD? In Latin American culture, humility, lowered eyes, and limited communication are appropriate when interacting with authority figures. So here, I must educate people to educate a person who is trying to make a police report to be forthcoming or to the police, or the police may see them as being untruthful. Finally, when interpreting, I must sometimes change the basic word order, the basic words in order for people to understand each other. A literal interpretation could literally result in miscommunication and a misunderstanding. So for example, you cannot translate a double negative in Spanish. They won't understand what you're saying. So you must change the basic sentence. So this level of interpretation comes from years of deep listening. Lastly, the skills and the joy of a singer require deep listening. Being part of a choir, I must listen closely to the other choristers in the soprano section and also in those in the other three sections to blend in pitch, volume, and tone to produce the desired effect. 10 years of singing with the cellist quartet taught me to listen even more deeply, to blend into one voice with three other singers. Sometimes when performing a duet, I try to blend the vibrations of my own voice with the vibrations of my partner. It can be spine tingling when you blend with others in a precise and beautiful way. During my years of training as a soloist, I have also learned to listen to my own voice to perfect my pitch, tone, and volume so that I may convey a pleasing or meaningful experience for the audience. This can be an intense and repetitive experience process that can result in deep satisfaction from deep listening over time. Deep listening has been worth it in my life, as it has resulted in profoundly moving and meaningful experiences with lasting results, not only for myself, but for others.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jamie.
Thank you.
Okay, and so next we will have Bruce.
And
hold on.
And you are unmuted.
Okay.
And I'm going to go out of the picture now because since he's giving it, I don't want to be sitting here. So.
Okay. Okay. Listening in two parts. And I have to say that when Jen mentioned that act of the deep listening, and I don't have exact words, but deep listening is when the heartstrings vibrate. That kind of hit home because as I was then looking at thinking about what I was going to say, those words, heartstrings vibrate, really is true on how listening works. So number one, listening number one. What? When? Really? Oh, how did that happen? Oh. This young man had been coming to our support group for people who are separated and divorced. He came in hurting, in pain. He wasn't the kind of person that deserved that. He was really a nice person. But, really? He had asked me a couple of times to have one-on-ones. We'd sit away from everyone else, go to a room, and he would talk. I would listen and reflect and help him to hear what he's saying. He asked me another time when I had been asked to have a one-on-one with someone else. But we had talked at least twice, in depth, listening, hearing pain, hearing hurt, hearing how he just could not understand what was happening. Really? What did we miss? What didn't we know? What didn't we hear that we could have helped him? We didn't have suicide prevention training. We just were trained to be listeners and be facilitators. But when I heard that he died by suicide, I felt like I had been punched in the gut. Something happened. That what could I have done? What did I miss? What didn't I hear? The only thing I can say is we weren't trained to really be looking and hearing for suicide prevention. I wish I had. He might still be alive. Deep listening in a group. Deep listening one-to-one in pain. It's a powerful tool. And I just wish that many years ago, I'd known a little bit more about what are the key words and the key traits that I could have listened for, I might have heard. But I think about that young man quite often when it comes to deep listening, because somewhere along the line, we didn't hear something. And I don't know what it was I didn't hear. I wish I could tell. So for Jen's heartstrings That was not a nice sound. Deep listening number 2. But we sure stunk that one up. Man, we played that how many times? Man, it's like we've never seen that one before. What happened? None of us were together. It just didn't work. Polly recognizes this because she's heard this. In Delphi, we're working together. It takes deep listening, as what Jamie said, to put a performance together, to work together. We have to listen to each other. First time we play, we're not hearing each other much, we're working on our parts. As we build in, we listen more, we hear what each other is doing, it expands and builds. It becomes much more intimate in what we're hearing and what we're doing. Hey, that really clicked. Do you think we could ever do that again? We listened. Things made sense on here. I sure like what you did with the melody on there. You played some neat ideas. Yeah, what you did with your solo. That was great. It's fun hearing that, to put something together with that. It's not the painful listening. It's a joyful listening. It's a listening that when we're done, there's laughter. There's a sense of accomplishment and a sense of pure joy that we have done something together. Both are deep listening. Both have very different impacts. What makes your heartstring vibrate? What kind of listening makes you click? Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you very much. So up next, we have Katie Johnson. Katie's in the house.
No. Don't build your expectations too high. This is a tiny little story. When I first tried to think about a story somehow related to deep listening, I was trying to think of some time when I might have learned something really through some deep conversation I had and came up with nothing. But the story that came to mind is one in which I feel like I was sort of startled into listening to voices that I had not really paid attention to before. So this happened 5 years ago. It was November 15th, 2020, not 2020, must have been 2015, 2020 now, right? 2015. And how do I know the date so precisely? Well, our guest speaker at Sunday services that morning began her remarks by telling us that a young black man, it was Jamar Clark, had been killed by the Minneapolis police in the early hours that Sunday morning. I think she was in the midst of disbelief and outrage, and I think I remember that she said she had not had a full night's sleep. I think her purpose in leading with this information was to let us know the state of mind she was in as she joined us that morning. Our guest speaker that day was a woman named Lena Gardner, and at that time I did not know her or anything about her, though since then I've seen and heard her at a few UU events, and she has a more prominent role now as a founder and current executive director of Black Lives of UU Organizing Collective. According to the previous services list on our website, she was to speak about the justice component of UU faith and values. I suppose she did, and I probably absorbed some things from her talk that I took with me. But the lingering impact from that day came not from her sermon, but from me noticing my reaction to her telling us about Jamar Clark. I had not heard this news prior to coming to church, and when Lena shared the information, my thoughts included things like, are you sure? Aren't you maybe blowing things out of proportion? We don't have all the facts yet. They wouldn't shoot him for nothing. In other words, my reactions showed a complete trust in the system. My reactions were not only a dismissal of, but also a suspicion of, the understanding of the situation from someone much closer to it than I was. My initial reactions were racist on multiple levels, I'm sure. But this brief episode had a significant impact on me. I noticed even on that day that my initial reaction had been to dismiss her telling the story. And as I recognized this about my reaction and listened to my own internal discomfort, I started to realize that I had to learn to listen more deeply to people speaking out for justice. As events unfolded following the killing of Jamar Clark, I found myself switching away from asking why they couldn't protest in a less disruptive way. And I was switching toward trying to understand why people were willing to spend 18 days in cold and rainy weather protesting outside of the 4th Precinct Police Station. So although it's a short story, I mark that day as the beginning of a real shift in my thinking about how the experience of the justice system in general and policing in particular is not the same for everyone. It is also a moment that made me more acutely aware of how, although I don't intend to, I most certainly do have biases that incline me toward not listening, not giving as much value to the voices of who? To whom am I not listening today? People of color, indigenous people, people on the margins for other reasons, people who give information that challenges my assumptions or are just giving me some kind of information that I don't want to hear. Hopefully that experience of 5 years ago will continue to be a reminder to me to listen with the hope of better understanding.
Katie. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Katie. Beautiful.
And our last but not least storyteller tonight, Byron Johnson.
No, just put it on the corner there. I'll do a sound check. Okay. Thumbs up. Can you hear me okay? Great. Okay. I am an arrogant problem solver who has been married to the same partner for 32 years in a row. The solution to every problem begins with a clear and concise diagnosis. My partner does not want my diagnosis or solution when she is describing a problem she is having. Only in the last few years have I really finally understood this. But my partner does want a response from me, a very specific sort of response. I learned this lesson shortly after learning the one about keeping my solutions to myself. And this is a story about how that happened. My partner and I walk our dog along the Mississippi River. We discuss many topics on these walks. And during the quiet periods, I often mull over a math problem or an engineering problem that I'm having at work, hoping the air and motion and scenery will give me some flash of insight. One day, my partner unknowingly interrupted my problem-solving reverie with a heartfelt and trusting description of a worry that was on her mind. I listened carefully. Do you remember this?
What's talking about?
Inwardly congratulating myself on my newfound enlightenment, not sharing a single diagnosis observation, correction, or solution. She returned to her private contemplation, or so I thought, and I switched seamlessly back to my math quandary. She startled me a block later with, "Aren't you going to say anything?" No, I said warily. "Well, what are you thinking about?" she asked in mild frustration. My math problem," I said, truthfully but unwisely. "Well, that's kind of heartless," she said, and then definitely returned to her private contemplation. I had overcorrected. The rules are more subtle than I thought. The rules are specific for each human. Luckily, the rules can be discussed out loud, ahead of time. Who knew? Well, many people knew, actually. In the before times, some years ago, I don't know if it was before or after this seminal incident in our marriage, I participated with Rev Laura and 2 others from MSUS in a structured practice of deep listening. We each had a set amount of time in which we could talk about any topic we wanted to, so long as it was polite and civil, with no interruption or input from the others. After each person spoke, the others had a time window for sharing their thoughts according to a specific set of guidelines designed to prevent arrogant diagnoses and solutions. For example, we were strongly encouraged to ask questions that are open-ended and expansive rather than restricting. Questions that are guided by the language used by the person sharing. Questions that invite the sharer to go deeper into their experience. Questions that are motivated by the need of the person sharing, not the curiosity of the person asking. Questions that keep the focus on the experience of the sharer and away from the experience of the person asking the question. Questions that communicate that we heard and received the experience of the person sharing. You can imagine from that list that that was somewhat challenging for an arrogant problem solver. My impressions these years since taking part in those sessions are these. Intense focus on another person's ideas. Intense thoughtfulness of how to respond to another person's ideas within these guidelines. Accessing 3 other brains worth of supportive, non-critical insight into my own thoughts. A deep bond of trust with the other participants. This bond of trust still manifests itself in my interactions with these participants to this day. You know who you are. I was so moved and inspired by this experience that I'm interested in leading deep listening sessions in the future as interest allows. Thank you. How do you remember?
Sharon, for sharing that.